Hello friends, welcome back to your new community. Before we get started, I just want to encourage your new community to talk about what you'll do during the summer. In the past, new communities typically would take a break during the summer and reconvene in late September, early October. And based on interest and so forth, we would provide a form of a summer new community that was more sort of all church. But nevertheless, I've already heard from two new communities that they plan to continue through the summer. That's how excited they are to keep meeting together over the summer. So if you could discuss that as a group and have your facilitator get back to me about what you plan to do, then that will help us plan for just based on need and interest for the summer. Well, this past Sunday, we were in Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 to 13, and we're still in the Olivet Discourse. Jesus has been giving his teaching about the end. First, more an imminent end of the temple and Jerusalem, but also, I believe, speaking to the very end, that last day, the final judgment, when Christ will once and for all finally return and inaugurate his kingdom. And to unpack that more for his disciples, he tells two stories. And this week we're covering the first story, the first parable, which is of these 10 virgins waiting for the bridegroom as they joyfully anticipate playing their role in the wedding feast. I think the big thrust of the story was a sense of having God's grace in our life that produces good works to the very end. And the prayer that I was praying for myself, for you, for everyone who would listen, and what I hope would stick to your soul as a result of this passage was a prayer, something similar to this. Lord, give me grace to perpetually overflow good works until you call me home. I think that's one way to describe the Christian life, following Jesus and being his disciple. Having his grace at work in our hearts, our minds, our will, and that producing, turning into, converting into good works in the name of Christ until he calls us home. And so we were asking, big picture, how do I perpetually overflow good works until Christ calls me home? I think we see some of that in this parable. And bottom line, to distill it to its essence, we will do well. It's hard to go wrong in the Christian life if we perpetually dwell on Christ. If we center our affections, our thoughts, our devotion, our meditation on the person and work of Jesus the Christ. And I drew out several characteristics of Jesus that I saw in the parable. I think that are intentionally there as Jesus told this parable. And the first characteristic of Christ, was his desire. And we should perpetually dwell on Christ's desire, specifically for his church. We see this clearly in just the setting that Jesus chooses to tell the parable. It is the setting of a wedding feast. And we see this beautiful theme. It's a major theme from Genesis to the Old Testament to Jesus to the New Testament and, of course, at the very end, Revelation, especially in Revelation 21. And the theme is of a pure romance, a romance that is anchored in a covenant of marriage. We see it in God creating marriage for Adam and Eve, and then we see God comparing Israel to his bride, and at times adulterous and wayward. But we see it in Christ here, the parable he uses, that he is the bridegroom. He is the groom pursuing, desiring his bride, his beloved. And we see it in Paul's writings, and of course we see it in Revelation, that the church in the end, in Revelation 21, is compared to a beautiful bride adorned for her husband. And Christ is the great bridegroom. So, my question to all of us is your morality and your service motivated by Christ's goodness? We can have, there are plethora of motives to be a good person out there in our culture. But for the Christ follower, our motivation is Christ, His goodness, His love, and His service to you and me, His desire for you, for us, the church. And as we see that we are beloved, then that is to translate into an energy and joy in service and morality and goodness. Are you able to connect to God's grace these days as your source of strength in your Christianity? And so reflect on that. And of course, it's human to, even the spirit-filled human who's seeking to follow Christ, we ebb and flow. We have our good days and bad days, but always what is consistent is if we come back to Christ, if we abide in Christ, if we rest in His grace, then we find renewed, pure strength to continue serving. So talk about that. Next, I sought to show you from verses 2 to 4, so you could read that over again together, to dwell on Christ's demand, because certainly He had an expectation, a requirement of this bridal party of these 10 virgins. And so I want you to reference Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 to 16. I did this in the sermon this past Sunday, and I'm confident that these puzzle pieces of Matthew 5 and Matthew 25 here, that they click together. And I want you to answer the question, how does Jesus' use of a lamp in Matthew 5 help us understand the kingdom being like the 10 virgins waiting for the bridegroom? Okay? And then as a follow-up, recall the background of the 10 virgins, also known as the bridal party, from the sermon. How does the role and responsibility of the bridal party emphasize all the more Jesus' Matthew 5 lamp imagery? Okay, so the meaning He has for the lamp and the light, and by association the oil in the lamp in Matthew 5, how does that meaning inform the parable in Matthew 25? Next, if we're going to perpetually overflow good works until Christ calls us home, we need to perpetually dwell on Christ's delay. Jesus Himself uses the word delay to describe Himself in the parable as the bridegroom. And I want you to reference Peter's second letter, chapter 3, verses 8 to 10. How are we as Christ followers to understand Christ's quote-unquote delay? Because certainly He is not quote-unquote literally delayed. God's timing is always perfect. I think Jesus' timing, as we see Him live His life on earth and in His ministry, was always perfect and intentional. So how can we understand Christ's delay? And a bit more, just closer to home, are you feeling discouraged at God's timing for something in your life? How can we encourage you? Can we pray for you, please? If there is if you're working through something related to you feeling like God is delayed, please be consider sharing and let us be the church to you. Let us comfort you and support you, encourage you, pray for you. Next, in verses 7 to 9, we see Christ's deservedness. I hope these questions help you have a good discussion. Where do we see evidence of the virgins' excitement to welcome the bridegroom, of Christ's deservedness in their hearts? Because again, the bridegroom represents Christ. Now, how do you make sense of the 5 wise virgins not lending any oil to the 5 foolish virgins? And what does their unwillingness to share teach us about how we enter God's kingdom, about how we are saved? I think Christ intentionally includes this aspect of the story because He wants to teach us about how we enter His kingdom, His wedding feast. On the flip side, how we cannot enter. Okay? And then finally, we see Christ's deadline, and we need to dwell on that. That needs to be on the fore of our Christian conscience. And we see it in verses 10 to 13. So recall, this parable is ultimately addressing all those who would call themselves Christian. All the 10 virgins, the 5 wise and foolish, all wanted to enter the kingdom. And so practically speaking, applying that to today, all those who would call themselves Christian. Christ's deadline and shutting the door is undeniable in this parable. There will come a point when it is too late to be reconciled to God and enter his kingdom in eternity. How should this sober and inform our Christian faith and our posture until Christ calls us home? So I hope all these questions are helpful and good to catalyze just meaningful discussion, but please do make time to pray for one another. And I hope that this is so much more than just an intellectual exercise, that by the Spirit's help and through one another, that you can really apply Christ and his grace to your everyday real life. God bless you.